Chris moved through the forest with practiced ease, his boots crunching softly against the frosted ground. The towering pines above swayed gently in the crisp morning air, their branches creating faint, whispering sounds that only emphasized the stillness of the wilderness around him. He adjusted the strap of his pack, scanning the trail ahead for anything out of the ordinary. His patrols through these woods were usually quiet, offering little more than the soothing sounds of nature. Today, however, felt different. The early sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long, jagged shadows across the uneven terrain. The air was cold enough to bite at his exposed skin, and Chris rubbed his hands together, exhaling puffs of visible breath. He paused for a moment to listen, his instincts suddenly on edge. That was when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was low and guttural, almost like a growl but weaker, strained. Chris froze in place, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees ahead. At first, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him, but then the sound came again, louder this time. His heart quickened as he adjusted his footing, moving cautiously in the direction of the noise. As he crested a small hill overlooking a clearing, he spotted it. His breath caught in his throat. Just a few dozen yards away, partially obscured by the base of a large tree, was a bear. Not just any bear. This one was enormous, its dark, hulking form barely moving. Chris's hand instinctively moved toward the sidearm holstered at his hip, but he stopped himself. The bear wasn't acting aggressively. In fact, it seemed to be in distress. He stepped closer carefully, his boots making the faintest of sounds against the frost-covered leaves. The bear's posture was strange, its massive body hunched forward, one paw stretched out at an awkward angle. It took Chris a moment to realize what was wrong. The bear's paw was caught in a device, likely left behind by a trapper. Even from this distance, Chris could see the strain in the animal's body, the tension in its limbs as it tried to pull itself free. Chris's chest tightened. The device was old and rusted, its jagged edges clamped tightly around the bear's paw. The sight filled him with both anger and pity. Whoever had set this trap hadn't just broken the law. They had left an innocent creature to suffer. He knew he had to do something. He crouched low, moving slowly behind the cover of a tree as he tried to assess the situation. The bear was enormous, easily twice his size, if not more, and even in its weakened state, it was still a dangerous predator. One wrong move, and it could lash out, driven by pain and fear. Chris took a deep breath, steadying himself. The animal let out another low growl, its dark eyes darting toward him. The sound rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder, sending a shiver down his spine. For a moment, Chris considered backing away. What if the bear attacked? What if his attempt to help only made things worse? But then he saw the bear's eyes again, and something about the way it looked at him, full of desperation, fear, and exhaustion, spurred him into action. "I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured, his voice low and steady. He wasn't sure if the animal could sense his intentions, but he hoped his calm tone might ease its anxiety. Slowly, he reached into his pack and pulled out a multi-tool, its edges catching the faint light of the morning sun. He held it up for a moment, as if to show the bear he meant no harm. The animal's growl quieted slightly, but its body remained tense. Chris took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching softly against the snow. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, and it let out another warning growl, its muscles rippling as it shifted its weight. Chris stopped, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Easy there," he said. "I just want to help." He inched closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Every step felt like an eternity, the tension in the air almost palpable. The bear's eyes followed him, wary but not hostile. Its sides heaved with labored breaths, the effort of pulling against the device clearly taking its toll. Chris knelt down a safe distance away, setting the multi-tool on the ground where the bear could see it. The device was a crude but effective design, its rusted jaws clamped tightly around the bear's paw. Chris winced as he examined it more closely, noting how deeply it had bitten into the animal's flesh. He couldn't think about that now. His focus needed to be on getting the trap open without startling the bear. He picked up the multi-tool and adjusted the screwdriver attachment, his hands trembling slightly as he positioned it against the first screw. The bear growled again, a low rumble that sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Chris froze, holding his breath as he waited for the animal to settle. "It's okay," he whispered. "We'll get through this." The first screw was stiff, its rusted threads resisting every turn. Chris gritted his teeth, applying more pressure as he worked to loosen it. The metallic groan of the screw turning seemed to agitate the bear, which shifted its weight and let out a sharp snarl. Chris froze again, his heart hammering in his chest. "Easy," he said softly. "Almost there." He resumed his work, the multi-tool biting into the rusted screws one by one. Each turn felt like a small victory, but the tension in the air never eased. The bear's dark eyes remained fixed on him, its growls coming in low, irregular bursts. Chris kept his movements steady, trying not to let his fear show. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last screw came loose. Chris adjusted his grip on the multi-tool, positioning it carefully as he prepared to release the spring-loaded jaws of the device. This was the most dangerous part. One wrong move, and the trap could snap shut again, or worse, the bear could react unpredictably. With a deep breath, Chris pressed down on the release lever. The device's jaws sprang open with a metallic clang, freeing the bear's paw. Chris immediately leaned back, giving the animal as much space as possible. Chris adjusted the strap of his pack, his legs heavy as he trudged through the forest. The tension from the encounter with the bear still lingered in his chest, a dull thrum of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't shake the image of the animal's dark, wary eyes from his mind. For a fleeting moment, just before it had been freed, there had been something in its gaze, a flicker of understanding, perhaps, or something even deeper. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was just an animal, a dangerous one at that. The forest had returned to its usual stillness. The only sounds the crunch of his boots against the frost-laden ground and the occasional rustling of leaves overhead. Yet Chris couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he wasn't alone. It wasn't paranoia. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body was telling him that something was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder for what felt like the 100th time, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. At first, he saw nothing, but then, as he squinted into the dappled light, he caught a glimpse of movement, a hulking, dark shape lingering at the edge of his vision. Chris stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The bear! It was following him. Chris's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip, though he didn't draw it. The bear wasn't charging or growling. In fact, it seemed to be keeping its distance, its massive form half hidden behind the trees. Still, the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't normal. Bears didn't follow people, not like this. He turned fully to face the animal, his posture stiff with caution. "What do you want?" he called, his voice echoing faintly through the trees. The bear didn't respond, of course, but it also didn't retreat. It simply stood there, watching him with those same dark, unblinking eyes. Chris exhaled sharply, his breath clouding in the cold air. He knew better than to panic, but the situation was unnerving, to say the least. He took a cautious step backward, his hand still resting on his holster. The bear shifted slightly, its head tilting ever so slightly to the side, as if curious. "Go on," Chris said, his voice firmer now. "Get out of here. You're free, remember?" The bear didn't move. Chris felt a flicker of frustration bubble up beneath his fear. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had done his part. He had risked his life to free the animal, and now it was supposed to disappear back into the forest where it belonged. But instead, here it was lingering like some kind of shadow. With a shake of his head, Chris turned and resumed his path, quickening his pace slightly. He didn't dare break into a full sprint. He knew that running could trigger a predator's instincts, but he wanted to put as much distance between himself and the bear as possible. Yet, no matter how far he walked, the feeling of being watched never left him. Every few minutes, he would glance over his shoulder, and there it would be, a dark silhouette moving silently through the trees, always at a distance but never out of sight. By the time Chris reached the edge of the forest, The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dappled ground. He stopped at the base of a steep incline, turning once more to look behind him. The bear had stopped as well, standing just beyond the tree line. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. Chris felt a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest: fear, confusion, and something he couldn't quite name. He had always thought of animals as just that, animals. They didn't think or feel the way humans did. But this bear was different. "All right," Chris muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the animal. "Do what you want." With that, he turned and began climbing the incline, his legs burning with effort. When he reached the top, he paused to catch his breath and looked back one last time. The bear was still there, its massive form silhouetted against the fading light. It didn't follow him any further, but it didn't leave either. Chris shook his head, turning away and heading for the small cabin he called home. By the time he reached the front door, the sky had gone dark, and the stars were beginning to shimmer faintly above. He stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind him and locking it for good measure. That night, as he sat by the fire nursing a cup of hot coffee, he couldn't stop thinking about the bear. What was it doing? Why had it followed him? And more importantly, what was it going to do next? Chris didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear's eyes staring back at him, dark, knowing, and unyielding. The next morning, when Chris stepped outside, he froze in his tracks. There, at the edge of the clearing that surrounded his cabin, was the bear. It was sitting on its haunches, its massive head tilted slightly as it watched him. Chris stared at the animal, his heart pounding in his chest. Part of him wanted to grab his rifle and scare it off, but another part of him, the part that had looked into its eyes and seen something he couldn't explain, held him back. He took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching against the frost. The bear didn't move. Chris hesitated, then took another step, and another. When he was about halfway across the clearing, he stopped, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The bear let out a low huff, its massive shoulders rising and falling as it exhaled. Chris felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, despite the absurdity of the situation. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, his voice steady. "But if you're here for breakfast, you're out of luck." The bear didn't respond, of course, but it didn't seem to mind his words. It simply watched him, its gaze unwavering. Over the next few days, the bear became a constant presence. It never came too close, never acted aggressively, but it was always there, watching, waiting. Chris found himself talking to it more and more, if only to fill the silence. "Do you even understand me?" he asked one evening, leaning against the porch railing as the bear lingered at the edge of the clearing. "Or are you just here because you think I owe you something?" The bear let out a soft snort, and Chris couldn't help but chuckle. Chris moved briskly through the forest, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of trouble. The frost was starting to melt under the late morning sun, but the air still carried a biting chill. He had taken to patrolling the area more frequently over the past week, ever since he'd freed the bear from the trap. Something had changed in the forest. There was a new undercurrent of unease, of feeling that something was off. The signs were subtle at first. Tracks where there shouldn't have been any. Oddly disturbed patches of earth that looked suspiciously like they had been dug up and covered again. The deeper Chris ventured into the woods, the more his gut told him that he wasn't imagining things. Someone had been here, and they didn't belong. A familiar rustling sound behind him made him pause. He turned, and sure enough, there it was, the bear. It stood at a distance, watching him as it always did, its massive frame partially hidden by the trees. Over the past few days, Chris had grown used to its presence, though he still didn't fully understand why it had chosen to stay near him. "Still here, huh?" Chris muttered, adjusting the strap of his pack. "Well, suit yourself." The bear let out a low huff, as if in response, and Chris shook his head. He didn't have time to dwell on the animal's behavior. There were more pressing matters to deal with. He continued down the trail, his boots crunching softly against the frost-covered ground. The deeper he went into the forest, the more signs of human activity he found. Broken branches, discarded wrappers, and then his chest tightened, a second trap. This one was newer, the metal shining starkly against the earth. Unlike the rusted trap he had found before, this one was fresh, its jaws gleaming and its spring taut. Chris crouched down, examining it closely. It was a brutal piece of equipment, designed to hold its victim with no chance of escape. Anger flared in his chest. Whoever had set these traps wasn't just breaking the law. They were endangering the fragile balance of the forest. Chris clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. He couldn't let this continue. As he reached for the trap to disarm it, a sound behind him made him freeze. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling of the trees, but it was enough to set his nerves on edge. Slowly, Chris turned his head, scanning the forest around him. At first, he saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. Great, he muttered under his breath. The bear let out a low growl, its body tensing as it picked up on the same movement. Chris straightened, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. He couldn't see who or what was out there, but he knew better than to take any chances. "Show yourself," he called, his voice firm but steady. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, followed by another and another. 3 men stepped into the clearing, their faces partially obscured by hats and scarves. They were dressed in heavy jackets, each of them carrying rifles slung over their shoulders. Chris's stomach churned. Poachers. Well, one of the men drawled, his voice dripping with smug confidence. "Look who we have here." Chris squared his shoulders, his hand still resting on his pistol. "This is protected land," he said evenly. "You have no business being here." The man chuckled, exchanging a glance with his companions. "Protected, huh? Doesn't look so protected to me." Chris's grip on his pistol tightened. "Take your traps and get out. Now." The second man, taller and bulkier than the first, took a step forward, his rifle shifting on his shoulder. "Or what? You gonna stop us?" Chris's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He was outnumbered, and these men were armed. He needed to be smart about this. Before he could respond, a deep, guttural growl rumbled through the clearing. The poachers froze, their eyes darting to the source of the sound. The bear stepped forward from the shadows, its massive frame looming over the clearing like a dark specter. "Holy!" one of the men stammered, taking a step back. The bear let out another growl, louder this time, its muscles rippling with barely restrained power. Chris could feel the tension in the air shift. The men, so confident just moments ago, now looked uncertain. "Get rid of it," the first man barked, raising his rifle. "Don't," Chris snapped, his voice sharp. He stepped forward, placing himself between the poachers and the bear. "If you fire that gun, you won't leave this forest alive." The men hesitated, clearly weighing their options. The bear took another step forward, its dark eyes locked onto the poachers. It didn't charge, but it didn't need to. Its sheer presence was enough to send a clear message. This was its territory, and it wasn't going to back down. Chris's mind raced. He needed to de-escalate the situation before someone did something reckless. "This doesn't have to end badly," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Take your traps and leave. Now." The first man glared at him, his jaw clenched. But as the bear let out another growl, the resolve in his eyes faltered. "Fine," he spat. "But this isn't over." He motioned for his companions, and the 3 of them began to retreat, their movements tense and hurried. Chris watched them go, his hand still hovering near his pistol until they disappeared into the trees. When the forest was silent once more, Chris exhaled, his shoulders slumping with relief. He turned to the bear, which was still standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on the spot where the poachers had been. "Looks like I owe you one," Chris said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The bear huffed softly, as if acknowledging his words, before turning and lumbering back into the shadows. Chris stood there for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The poachers would be back, he was sure of it. But now, he wasn't facing them alone. The air was thick with heat and smoke, the kind that clawed at Chris's throat with every breath. The normally serene forest had been transformed into a chaotic nightmare. Flames licked at the treetops, consuming everything in their path with a relentless, roaring hunger. Chris ran, his boots crunching against the scorched ground as he pushed deeper into the inferno. His radio crackled faintly on his shoulder, a distant voice calling for evacuation, but he barely registered it. His focus was elsewhere. Somewhere out there, the bear was in trouble. The fire had started quickly, spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a faint, acrid smell during Chris's routine patrol had erupted into a full-blown wildfire in a matter of hours. He had been on the edge of the blaze when he first heard it, a distant, guttural roar cutting through the chaos. His stomach had dropped. It was the bear. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. And now, against all common sense, he was heading straight into the flames to find it. Chris coughed, pulling his jacket up to cover his nose and mouth. The smoke was suffocating, turning the air into a choking, unbreathable haze. His eyes stung as he scanned the burning forest, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and urgency. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his voice muffled by the fabric. "Where are you?" The fire raged around him, a living, breathing entity that seemed intent on driving him back. Trees cracked and groaned as they succumbed to the flames, collapsing with thunderous crashes that sent sparks shooting into the air. Chris ducked as a burning branch fell just a few feet away, the heat singeing his exposed skin. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get out while he still could. But he couldn't, not while the bear was still out there. He climbed over a fallen log, his boots slipping on the ash-covered surface. His movements were quick but deliberate, every step calculated to avoid the most dangerous patches of flame. Then he heard it again, a low, desperate roar, closer this time. Chris's head snapped in the direction of the sound, and he broke into a run, ignoring the protests of his aching legs. When he found the bear, his heart twisted painfully in his chest. The massive creature was trapped, its back against a cluster of burning trees. Flames surrounded it on three sides, leaving no clear escape. The bear paced anxiously, its movements panicked as it let out another roar. Its dark eyes darted around the clearing, searching for a way out, but there was none. The heat was intense, the fire creeping closer with every passing second. Chris hesitated for only a moment. He knew the risks, knew that getting too close to the bear in its current state could be as dangerous as the fire itself. But he also knew he couldn't leave it there to die. "Hey," he called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. The bear stopped pacing, its head snapping toward him. Its eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. Chris took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm going to get you out of here." The bear let out a low growl, its muscles tensing as it backed further against the burning trees. Chris could see the fear in its eyes, the primal panic that came from being cornered. He needed to act quickly. Scanning the clearing, Chris spotted a narrow gap between the flames, just wide enough for the bear to squeeze through if it moved fast enough. But it was risky. The fire was unpredictable, and the path could be cut off at any moment. Chris swallowed hard, his mind racing. He couldn't force the bear to move. It had to trust him. "Come on, big guy," he murmured, taking another step forward. The heat was unbearable now, beads of sweat dripping down his face as the flames crackled around him. He pointed toward the gap, his movements slow and deliberate. "That's your way out. You just have to go for it." The bear huffed, its ears flattening against its head. It didn't move. Chris clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up beneath his fear. The fire was getting closer, the smoke growing thicker with every passing second. He couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer, closing the distance between himself and the bear. The animal growled, its body tensing as he reached out a hand, but it didn't attack. Chris's fingers brushed against its fur, coarse and warm from the heat, and he felt a surge of relief. It was letting him get close. "Good," he said softly. "That's good." He moved to the bear's side, positioning himself between it and the flames. The fire roared behind him, the heat so intense it felt like it was burning through his jacket. He could feel the bear's powerful muscles trembling beneath his touch, its body coiled like a spring ready to explode. Chris knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. "Go," he shouted, his voice rising above the roar of the fire. He pushed gently against the bear's side, urging it toward the gap. "Move!" For a moment, the bear didn't react. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, it bolted. Chris stumbled back as the massive animal surged forward, its body brushing past him as it squeezed through the narrow opening. The flames licked at its sides, but it didn't stop, charging into the safety of the unburned forest beyond. Chris let out a shaky breath, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. But there was no time to rest. The fire was closing in, and he still had to get out. Staggering to his feet, he followed the bear's path, his lungs burning as he forced himself to keep moving. The gap was even narrower now, the flames creeping dangerously close to the edges. Chris gritted his teeth and dove through, his jacket catching briefly on a branch before he tumbled into the dirt on the other side. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air as the cool, smoke-free breeze washed over him. When he finally sat up, the bear was standing a few yards away, its dark eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the bear let out a low, rumbling huff, a sound that Chris could only describe as gratitude. Chris let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "You're welcome," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The bear turned and lumbered off into the trees, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. Chris watched it go, a strange warmth spreading through his chest despite the exhaustion weighing down his limbs. They had survived. Together. Chris leaned against the porch railing, the morning air crisp and cold against his skin. The forest stretched out before him, shrouded in mist, its familiar silence broken only by the occasional chirp of birds. For weeks now, the bear had been a constant presence in his life, a silent shadow that lingered at the edge of his world. But today, the clearing beyond his cabin was empty. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chill. He knew this day would come. Animals like the bear didn't belong near humans, not permanently. It was wild, untamed, and free. Yet, the quiet absence of its hulking form felt heavier than he'd expected. He shook his head, brushing the thought aside. The bear hadn't gone far. It never did. Chris's relationship with the bear had become an unspoken partnership over time. The days of cautious glances and distant stalking had given way to something almost familiar. The bear would follow him on his patrols, often keeping its distance, but always present. Chris found himself talking to it, even joking sometimes, though it never responded beyond a huff or a grunt. It was strange, this connection they shared, one born of fire, danger, and mutual survival. But it couldn't last forever. He knew that. The first sign of change had come a few days ago. The bear had begun wandering further and further away, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time. Chris had tried to convince himself it was a good thing, that the animal was reclaiming its independence. But he couldn't deny the pang of emptiness each time he turned to find the space where it should have been. Today felt different, though. Final, somehow. As the morning wore on, Chris set out for his usual patrol, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The forest was still recovering from the fire, its once lush greenery now marred by patches of charred earth and skeletal trees. Yet life was slowly returning. Shoots of green peeked through the ashes, a testament to the resilience of nature. Chris's eyes scanned the forest as he walked, his instincts tuned to every sound and movement. He knew the bear was nearby. He could feel it, and sure enough, as he rounded a bend in the trail, he spotted it, a massive, dark shape moving silently through the trees. The bear stopped when it saw him, its head tilting slightly, as if considering whether to approach. Chris smiled faintly. "There you are," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." The bear didn't respond, of course, but it took a few steps closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Chris noticed something different in its posture, something more confident, less reliant. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. It was a reminder that their time together was coming to an end. They walked together in companionable silence, the bear trailing a few paces behind as Chris made his way through the forest. He disarmed a few remaining traps he found along the way, muttering under his breath about the poachers who had set them. The bear watched him with its usual calm, its dark eyes following his every move. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the forest in hues of orange and gold, Chris found himself at the edge of a wide clearing. He stopped, his gaze sweeping across the open expanse. This was where it had all begun, the place where he had first freed the bear from the trap. The memory felt distant now, almost surreal. The bear stepped into the clearing behind him, its massive form silhouetted against the setting sun. Chris turned to face it, his chest tightening. He didn't know why he'd brought them here, but now that they were standing in the spot where their story had started, it felt right. Full circle. You know, he said, his voice quiet, this is where we met. Or at least where I thought you were going to kill me. The bear huffed softly, its breath visible in the cool evening air. Chris chuckled, though the sound was tinged with melancholy. I guess we've been through a lot since then, huh? He fell silent, his hands resting on his hips as he looked at the bear. It stood a few feet away, its head slightly lowered, its gaze locked on his. Chris had seen that look before, back in the fire, back when they had relied on each other to survive. But now it felt different. This wasn't a look of fear or desperation. It was something else. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding. I think you're ready, Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't need me anymore. The words felt heavy as they left his mouth, but he knew they were true. The bear had begun to reclaim its wild instincts, its independence. It was stronger now, more confident. It didn't need a human to watch over it. Not anymore. Chris took a step back, his throat tightening. Go on, he said, motioning toward the forest. This is your home, not mine. The bear didn't move. For a long moment, it simply stood there, its massive frame unmoving, its dark eyes fixed on Chris. Then, slowly, it lowered its head, as if acknowledging his words. Chris swallowed hard, his chest aching in a way he hadn't expected. He had always known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. He watched as the bear turned, its movements deliberate and steady. It lumbered toward the edge of the clearing, pausing briefly to glance back at him one last time. Chris raised a hand in a silent farewell. Take care of yourself, he murmured. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The clearing felt impossibly empty without it, the silence pressing down on Chris like a weight. He stood there for a long time, the sun dipping lower and lower until the sky was awash with stars. When he finally turned to leave, his steps felt heavier than they had in weeks. But as he made his way back to the cabin, a strange sense of peace settled over him. The bear was where it belonged, living the life it was meant to live. And though their paths had diverged, Chris knew he would carry the memory of their time together with him always. The forest had changed him. That much Chris knew. Standing on the porch of his cabin, he stared out at the endless expanse of trees, now fully regrown in vibrant shades of green. The scars of the fire had faded, but the memory of that desperate battle, and of the bear, remained etched in his mind. Every time he walked those trails, he could almost see the hulking figure of his companion, just out of view. The bear had taught him something he could never forget. The wilderness was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that needed protection. The silence around him felt different now, heavier somehow. For weeks after the bear's departure, Chris had wrestled with an ache he couldn't quite name. He missed the sound of its huffs in the distance, the shadow of its presence during his patrols. But it wasn't just the absence of the bear that haunted him. It was the realization that the forest, their forest, was still under threat. The poachers, the traps, the fire, all of it had opened his eyes to a deeper truth. Someone had to do something. And if not him, then who? Chris's decision didn't come all at once. It started as a quiet resolve, a thought that grew into action as the days turned into weeks. He began by walking the forest daily, marking areas where traps had been laid before and documenting signs of human activity. At first, it felt futile. For every trap he dismantled, another seemed to appear. For every poacher he scared off, there were whispers of others taking their place. But Chris was stubborn, and he refused to back down. The turning point came during one of his patrols. He had come across a family camping illegally in the forest, their tents set up dangerously close to a known wildlife corridor. The parents were defensive at first, dismissing his warnings as overreaction. But Chris's calm, measured explanation about the impact on the animals and the danger to their children seemed to break through their resistance. By the time they packed up and left, he realized something important. People didn't destroy the forest out of malice. Most of them just didn't understand what they were doing. It was a simple truth, but it stuck with him. Chris spent the next few months diving into books and online resources, teaching himself everything he could about conservation and wildlife protection. He started small, hosting talks at the local community center, sharing stories of his encounters in the forest, not just the dangers, but the beauty and balance he had witnessed firsthand. At first, only a handful of people showed up, but word spread quickly. The story of the bear, in particular, seemed to capture people's imagination. "I don't know why it followed me," Chris would say at the end of each talk, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe it understood that I saved it. Or maybe I was just lucky. But what I do know is that it trusted me. And I don't want to betray that trust." The bear became a symbol, not just for Chris, but for the growing group of volunteers and supporters who began to rally around him. Together, they formed the Forest Guardians, an initiative focused on protecting the local wilderness and educating others about the importance of coexistence with nature. The work wasn't easy. In fact, it was often humiliating in ways Chris hadn't anticipated. The first time he reached out to a major sponsor for funding, the representative on the other end of the call had laughed outright. "You're telling me this is all because of some bear?" the man had said, his tone dripping with skepticism. Chris had swallowed his pride and pressed on, but the rejection stung. There were other challenges, too. Local businesses that relied on logging and hunting permits began to push back against his efforts, accusing him of trying to sabotage their livelihoods. Flyers promoting the Forest Guardians were torn down almost as soon as they were put up, and Chris received more than a few anonymous threats warning him to back off. But for every setback, there was a victory. A small article about the Forest Guardians in the local paper caught the attention of a regional wildlife organization, which offered a modest grant to fund their patrols. A group of high school students, inspired by Chris's talks, organized a cleanup of one of the forest rivers, removing nearly 2 tons of trash in a single weekend. And slowly, people began to see the forest not as a resource to be exploited, but as a treasure to be protected. Chris didn't stop there. He began to expand the initiative, partnering with other conservation groups to advocate for stricter laws against poaching and illegal trapping. His name started to appear in larger publications, his story shared as an example of how one person's actions could ripple outward in ways they never expected. The humiliation of rejection and the constant uphill battle never truly went away. Chris found himself doubting his choices more than once, especially on nights when exhaustion pressed down on him like a weight. But every time he felt like giving up, he would remember the bear, the way it had looked at him during the fire, trusting him to lead it to safety, the way it had stood by his side, warding off the poachers, and the way it had disappeared into the forest, leaving him with a silent promise to continue the work they had started together. Years passed, and the Forest Guardians grew into something far larger than Chris had ever imagined. What had started as a single man's mission to protect his home had become a movement, one that reached far beyond the boundaries of the forest. Conservationists, scientists, and nature enthusiasts from across the region began to take notice, joining forces to create a network of protected areas and wildlife corridors. Chris, however, never let the scope of the work pull him too far from the forest that had inspired it all. He still walked its trails every day, dismantling traps, planting trees, and listening to the sounds of life that thrived within its depths. The bear was long gone by then, but its presence lingered in the rustle of the leaves and the whispers of the wind. One evening, as Chris stood at the edge of the clearing where he had last seen the bear, he noticed something in the distance, a dark shape moving silently through the trees. His heart leapt for a moment, but when the figure stepped into the fading light, he saw that it wasn't the same bear. This one was smaller, younger, It's for a lighter shade of brown. It paused briefly, its dark eyes meeting his before it turned and disappeared into the forest. Chris smiled, a bittersweet warmth spreading through his chest. The forest was alive, its legacy continuing long after he was gone. And as he turned to leave, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had done what he could,